Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marla Moore. I am a community outreach coordinator with the Howard County Office of Human Rights and Equity. It is our distinct pleasure to host this virtual Caribbean Heritage Month presentation that highlights how the country of Haiti's fight for independence inspired and continues to inspire freedom fighters across the globe. If you're watching us on Facebook, make sure to like our page so you can receive updates about our virtual and in-person events. If you're watching on the county YouTube channel, be sure to click subscribe to receive notifications about Howard County government offerings. If you're watching us on GTV, you better pull out that phone, open Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and follow us at HOCO, OHRE. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Office of Human Rights and Equity, we're an entity of the Howard County government that seeks to eradicate discrimination, increase equal opportunity, and protect and promote human rights in the county. This office serves as a catalyst in fostering attitudes and beliefs among county residents, which confirm that all individuals have an equal opportunity to enjoy a wholesome and productive quality of life free from discrimination. Under the leadership of Administrator Yolanda F. Saunier, we aim to provide county residents with excellent services and programming. We accomplish this mission through an investigations unit, equity and restorative practices unit, and the community outreach unit, which is bringing you this presentation this afternoon. And now, without further ado, I would love to introduce you to this afternoon's guest because she is an old friend of mine, and she is the most valuable artist, teacher, educator, and trainer, and I've gotten to work with her countless times over the years. Regine Romain is a Haitian-American artist, educator, visual anthropologist, and race equity strategist based in Brooklyn, New York. She has over 25 years of teaching, training, and supporting diverse communities on issues of race, culture, and representation through participatory and reflective learning practices. As a storyteller and cultural producer, she uses photographs, film, and performance as mixed media tools to ignite critical consciousness and racial change. The founder director of Wa Diaspora Center and the author of Bliye, a Haitian coloring book, she's also the producer director of an award-winning short film and podcast, Brooklyn to Benin, a Voodoo Pyramid, and Voodoo Roots, a love story musical. Regine received her Bachelor of Science in International Studies from Bliye State University and a Master's of Art in Photography and Urban Culture from Goldsmiths University of London. Hi, Regine.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing great this afternoon. So I'd like to know what you can tell us about the Haitian Revolution and how it influenced freedom fighters and those who seek freedom all over the world in a historical epic journey. From what? From Africa to the
Absolutely.
Caribbean to America.
Well, the first thing that I always like to do before I start is I like to start with a land acknowledgement. And I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement, recognizing that where we are, right? So where are we? So do you know the indigenous people? Do you know the name of the land where you are? Do you know where those people are, those that were here before you came, right? And so I want to start us with a grounding in honor and respect to those ancient and traditional societies. And for those of us that are here, we're shepherds of this land. One of the things that's important when we think about understanding Haiti's role, right? Haiti's role as first independent Black nation here in this Western Hemisphere, but also its linkage to Juneteenth, and also the way in which it connects with this upcoming celebration that we have here in the United States of the 4th of July. So beginning with just that, right? If we begin with an understanding that there were others that were here before us, if we understand that Haiti's liberation, right, in 1804 was grounded in a fight for survival, a fight, not just a fight, you know, of independence, it was actually a fight of survival. And so I want to call on the land of there also. I want to recognize the space in which people are struggling, people are living, people are trying their best on this land and in those in Haiti and in the Caribbean. So this month is Caribbean Heritage Month. It is also Immigrant Heritage Month. It is also Pride Month. Marla, is there anything else? There's quite a bit. What else is happening this month of June? And we're celebrating on this last day.
I really feel like you've captured it all. And if I forgot anybody, I'm sorry, but we have.
Is there anything else?
No, I think that's it. And you are the person who's capping off Caribbean Heritage for us.
Oh, okay. Yes. And so one of the things that I'd like us to just start with is recognizing first our land here, Juneteenth. The celebration that many of us know as Juneteenth has become a federal holiday is a celebration that many people of color have had, and Black people specifically in this country, for a very, very long time. It has become a federal holiday, but though it has become a federal holiday, it's interesting for us to recognize that there are actual states, actual cities and counties that actually block the conversation around Juneteenth, block the conversation around race, block the conversation around slavery. Unfortunately, even some of our school books that our children have negate the actual narrative around slavery, and unfortunately are starting to call that experience indentured servitude or migrant workers. And we understand that migrant workers and enslaved people are not at all the same thing. They're not at all the same. So when we think about what's happened here and what is happening here, foundationally, we have to recognize that there is a complex place in which the United States history places itself. One, there's so much that's happened within this past week, right? So one, we're looking at what's happening with the Supreme Court. We're looking at, you know, our elected officials, what's happening. We have gun violence, you know, that's unfortunately taken the lives of many innocent people. But when we think about why it is important to recognize the celebration of Juneteenth and how it connects to the story of Ayiti, is we have to recognize that the foundation of this country was based on terror. It was based on annihilating the indigenous people who were here and then bringing in forced labor. That forced labor was African people taken from their homelands. And so when we think about what it means to be a part of building a nation, but yet being negated in its history, being a part of the spur of the Industrial Revolution, but yet not being recognized in our school books, in our history and what's being taught around our country. It is important to recognize that many feel that this federal holiday is a wonderful step forward, but there's much more that's necessary. And so I just want to hail up an understanding around Juneteenth, and that Juneteenth is very much necessary in considering the liberation of enslaved people here and then taking it to Haiti.
Quick question. Now, you know, Juneteenth was 1865, and I might be wrong, but I believe the Haitian Revolution ended around 1805, 1804?
1804.
Okay, so is it possible, because I feel like the same way that the enslaved Africans were able to, in this country, communicate the news of freedom and the hope and the path to freedom, you know, from the deep, deep South to Canada, is it possible that we heard the news of Haiti here? I know some people are thinking about that, like how does news between continents and between people of color, Black, especially the African diaspora, how did it travel? Because that would be fascinating if we were like, wow, the Haitians are making moves. Jamaicans are making
Exactly.
moves. The different islands are, this is the whole cool thing. I don't know if many of you have traveled. Let's assume that we're starting from zero. If you go throughout the Caribbean, you might see some remnants or even a few surviving great houses, which are akin to what plantations in America, and you may see them. But due to the distant and disparate what traveling journey and knowledge in America, a lot of our old slave mansion plantations survive. But in the
Hmm.
Caribbean, you'll see some remnants and maybe one or two because the people were able to burn those houses of evil down. So is
Mm.
it possible that we could have found that news in America?
Actually, Marla, I have to tell you, that news spread like wildfire in the
Right.
Caribbean and in the Americas. But you have to understand there were two different factions, right? So the first was enslaved African people and the indigenous people that were still being terrorized in the Caribbean and in the Americas, right? So the news from Ayiti, from the hand of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the Declaration of Independence, pamphlets and printings went out throughout the Caribbean, right? There was a recent case of a student at Duke University who, in digging through the archive of England, she was in the UK, and digging through the archives of Jamaica, she found an original form of that Haitian Declaration of Independence. That is a recent happening from Duke University. And there's quite a bit. If you can look it up, you can put Duke University student, Haitian Declaration, right? And why that's important is because that is how it was spread. Number one, understanding that other Africans captured, marooned, and enslaved were still in servitude, in bondage. The visionaries of Haiti said, no, this can't be. It cannot be. We cannot not share this news. But you have to understand the news spread like wildfire in two ways. One, for liberation, happiness, people knowing that Haiti is free. And then the other side were slave owners. The slave owners are our former presidents. The slave owners are our former senators and politicians,
Yeah.
the wealthy. That those were terrified by that news. They were terrified by that news and tried to suppress it. And in that suppression of Haiti's liberation, part of that suppression was because, unfortunately, Black people are still maligned to this day due to the constructs of race, right? So when we think about how did this construct even happen, we have to go back into Europe's quote unquote age of enlightenment, where Kant, Hume, Hegel, many of those early philosophers wrote extensively about race. They talked extensively about the superiority of one race over the other. So when slavery was in its full trenches, where millions of Africans were being stolen out of their native homelands and brought to work in the Caribbean and in the Americas, the view of them as human, the view of them as worthy, the view of them as worthy of having rights the same as someone white, unfortunately, was not upheld. So the audacity of Black people in Haiti to fight for 14 years for their liberation was audacious, was just like it was not anything expected. It was not expected that they would succeed because they were fighting not only France, the colonizer of that part of the island, because the other part had been split. It had been split with Spain, and so the other part was run by Spain. And Saint Domingue, which was the old name of Haiti under the French, was now liberated. So when you that returning to that earlier question that you have, did the news spread? Absolutely. Absolutely. Folks knew, Black folks, the word had spread, right? Throughout the Caribbean that there was a group of people who had called themselves free. And I want us to just consider what that word free means. Many of us, for us, it's contextualized within our own experience, right? I'm free today. That means I don't have to work, or I'm working, but my schedule's light. I'm free. I can meet you out for lunch. There's all these different ways in which we may think about what freedom is. But if we can go and if we can return to 1865, if we can even go further and think about 1804 from what we've learned historically, it did not mean, oh, I was free for lunch, or I'm not working so much today. What it meant was that people had the right to control their mind, body, and spirit. They had the right to live their life as they saw it. They were able to call on their African gods, their African traditions, their African culture, and their African language and way of being. The reason why Ayiti still to this day resembles a Afrique, a little Africa, is because it never left its spirit. It never left its soul. The experience of colonialization definitely is a part of the Haitian experience, because French is one of the official languages along with Creole. But we have to understand that there's a place in which when people were thinking about freedom, when they were fighting for freedom, it was actually their body and soul. It was not, I'm free for lunch, right? And so the news did spread. And unfortunately, if you look at the writing of the time, Haiti's independence was called the horrors of Saint-Domingue. The horrors of Saint-Domingue, right? That is how the US press and international media retold the story. So in modern times, we know what it means to experience fake news, right? Fake news is not new. Fake news is one in which the views of a particular media entity are being promulgated as truth, but we understand that it is not. So what happened with Haiti's independence, there was so much fear from slave owners, from white slave owners in the Americas and in the Caribbean and in Europe, that all of the writing negated the fact that these were human beings fighting for their independence, very much like the fight the United States had against Great Britain,
And
right?
when,
Our 4th
oh,
of July
excuse me,
celebration speaks
yes,
to that, yes.
you just mentioned fake news, so you know I have to cut in. For people who want to go to Google University, because we're having a conversation, it's not visual aids today, but please feel free to look among archival papers and arts, and you will see that if you understand the evil science of eugenics, which is to justify that brown people or melanated people or people of Asian descent or Latinx descent or African descent are not human, has been going around since the dawning of slavery to justify this is just an animal. This is not a person. They don't have a brain. We know that with the early 1600s, when they decided that African Americans, enslaved people, were not going to be given the liberties of what an indentured servant from Europe would have. Then that's when the writing of calling us dirty savages, and when people traveled, they called it the dark continent of Africa. And I want people to understand that our indigenous religions like Voodoo, anything Yoruba, all these things were called
The
dark,
Igbo, yes.
evil, yes, everything. So this whole conspiracy started, and it's quite literal. And so by the time we then move forward in history and look at a lot of our people like Henry Ford, or even the aviator, what's the famous one that I can't remember his name, sorry y'all, but who traveled around Lindbergh. They were notorious racists, and they believed in eugenics. Okay, and described us. So Black people have always been fighting for our humanity against very negative press. Did not start with the news media today. And if you watch it, I think there's a liberation. And looking at some of those old images of Blacks eating watermelon, or the slaves, looking, dancing, and all those kind of things that, make you sick to your gut. But it's knowing that I don't have to fall victim to this lie.
Right. Absolutely.
So I have a question. Tell us more, because when I think of the liberation, right? When I think of liberation in America, I'm going to give people an American reference of, say, Nat Turner, who's someone whose name we do not mention, and John Brown. Who are our rebels, and who are our outliers of the Haitian Revolution?
Well, a big part of understanding the Haitian Revolution is that we have to go back. So before we can have the celebration of 1804, we have to recognize that there was a fundamental space in which these human beings strategized for their independence. It was not a random act. I think that one of the things that's difficult to really embrace, not really to embrace, but really, I guess, really to continue to see, is the way in which Black and brown people are presented as not being able to govern or rule themselves, right? That is troubling. It is tremendously troubling, because the reality is that the cradle of civilization began on the continent of Africa. To this day, most of the resources that we all are using in our cell phones, all are being sponsored by the continent. Like, literally, the continent of Africa is helping us to stay alive. If we look at what is happening in on the continent in connection to Ayiti, it's very much similar. There was a New York Times article that just came out that I highly recommend folks take a look at and read. The title of the article is the root of Haiti's misery, reparations to enslavers. Now, what's interesting about this New York Times article is that it's a huge expose, and for many people, it's the very first time that they've ever, if they've ever learned of that, right? Like, it's what's crazy about it is that it's known history. It's known. It's a known thing that Haiti is the only nation that has ever fought for its independence, where those that were enslaved, formerly enslaved, were made to pay reparations to the descendants of their enslavers. I mean, I just want us to just stop and consider, what does that mean? What does that mean for a nation that is newly developed, right? What does that mean for a nation that fought for 14 years? When I mentioned we can't just go from the celebration of 1804, the beginning of the revolution started from the moment that people were taken out of their home, the moment that people were forced to go across the Middle Passage, right? So what's interesting is recognizing that many people are unable to recognize that there was always resistance. No one chose to become a slave, right? So there was always a fight. There was always resistance. And formally, it began at the Congress of 1791 in Haiti. That Congress is called Bois-Caïman. And Bois-Caïman was not only a Congress of leaders, of the Maroons, of the captains, of the military. It was also a spiritual calling. It was also a space in which terrorized people called on their gods and their ancestors to liberate them from such a horrific experience. And so the Haitian Revolution began with a military strategic Congress, and also began with a prayer. And so I encourage you to look up Bookman's prayer, because Bookman's prayer, who was one of the attendees, his words speak to the situation in such poignant and powerful ways. And so from that space of strategy and prayer, foundationally, what you see is enslaved people, that's always has been what we've had to do. We've had to rely on our spiritual beliefs. We had to rely on our sense of self, knowing that we were greater than what we were being taught to be, or thought, what we were told that we could or could not be, right? And recognizing that same liberation, that same space in which enslaved people fought for 14 years in Haiti is very much the same experience that folks here in the United States fought so that we could have the celebration of Juneteenth. But understanding that Juneteenth is in many ways not, it needs to be observed, but in many ways for some, it's important to know the history, right? Yes, there are celebrations that happen for Juneteenth in Black communities, but you have to understand that it actually is really kind of a messed up thing, right? People were liberated, but the southern states did not let them know. They were liberated, but the slave owners didn't want them to be free. So that's what the thing we have to understand, that Juneteenth is not a space in which Target or Whole Foods or whoever can now jump on the bandwagon and say, oh, we've got your Juneteenth ice cream. No, it's clear. We have to know the history. You have to know that people were liberated, but were being forced further into servitude. And so that celebration of Juneteenth is the acknowledgement of their freedom.
I feel like Juneteenth is a bittersweet thing because, the people in Texas were far flung from the rest of the war, and they found out 2.5 years later. And so we celebrate in the spirit of, unless all of us are free, none of us are free, in solidarity. But I think if we look at the first Juneteenth celebrations, and you can search that imagery, because thank God a lot of archival pictures and images and records still exist. Okay. And if you consider that that was around the dawning of like photography, that's really deep. But you can see that Black people, it was somber. Yes, people ate in those things, but they prayed, and they, before the feast, and they thought about it and contemplated, because though they were able to choose their clothes, their God, they were able to choose where they live. A lot of them were, as you already said, going into the sharecropping system and servitude. And unfortunately, we can continue all the work that our country has done, or that Haiti has done, or that countries in the continent of Africa, so much in one way or another. Black people are still enslaved because we have not been given proper reparations. We have not given equal access. We've been given the illusion of freedom. And then I know throughout the Caribbean and parts of Africa, you can search this list. There are many countries that are yet today paying a tax or paying for their freedom to countries in Europe. So you think it's so cute. Oh, I see France, I see Sweden, I see all these places with free health care, school, child care, 6 weeks of holiday, but they are still thriving on the backs of Africa and the Caribbean. And America is still thriving off of the labor of African Americans and others who are marginalized.
Absolutely. When I was living in Benin, I lived in Benin for 2 years, from 2016 to 2018. There was a movement for Africans who were still using the CFA, which is the form of money that is tied to France, where basically African nations are putting their money into France's coffers, right? And then France then gives them their money back. And if they need more of their money, they have to pay France a percentage. They have to pay fees to get their own money.
That's like reverse welfare. I'm going to say
it
something
is.
crazy like that.
But and it is. And so, I mean, and there were a couple of presidents of France, I can't remember the name, that basically said that France would not exist if it was not for the money that they got from reparations, a horrible it's not even the right word. I don't even think it's the right word to consider that it's a reparations that was paid. It's horrible, right? So, but formerly enslaved Africans were paid to, were forced to take a loan from France to pay back France, okay?
Yes.
And then formerly colonized nations on the continent of Africa are there's at least 7 or 8 countries that are still using the CFA, right? And the formerly colonized French nations that said no, unfortunately, we should take a look at what happened to their political leaders, what happened to their nation, right? Guinea is one of the countries when Guinea told France to leave, unfortunately, France did not take it well and destroyed everything that they had built there, the hospital, the roads, everything. And so when it's a difficult thing to consider, that the way that we live our life, the morals, the way in which we think everything should be, right? Because we're based in a construct in a way of being that is very much kind of operates on almost on a missionary level, where other nations previously that did not have, um, let's just use the example, for instance, Roe versus Wade. For 50 years, the United States has promoted that, that women should have rights, women should be able to govern their body. Now with that reversal, what happens? Right. So if we are not able to think beyond the political systems and the political jargon that we're told, if we're not grounded within our own thought processes, and if we're not clear about what we know to be right and wrong, we'll just be swaying in the wind. Right. So whatever your views are, whether you're for Roe versus Wade or against it, the reality, though, is that the United States, because of its political power, has often pushed its political ideas on others, has pushed its way of being on other nations, right?
And so
And
is the
so when we think,
continent of Europe. And also, it's not just
exactly,
politics, it's in scholarly writings, the academic
yes,
institutions that we go to, because
standards
I
of
know that
beauty,
anything that we're dealing with. And one thing I want to put out there, I lived in Guinea for 2 years, and a lot of the people stolen from Guinea and other francophone Africa, were sent to the South here, and were sent to French-speaking Caribbean islands as well. So when you see the impact of Guinea being a proud country, but one of the poorest countries who had to pay reparations, and you can still ride through and see the jacked up roads. You can see how they have so much of a lack of infrastructure that keeps them from prospering. But I want you to consider this, and I want everyone, if you love Haiti or Jamaica or any of these places, if you think you're a student of the world, if you think you're progressive or liberal, stop calling the developing world third world, even as a joke, even as, oh, it's the third world, because you know what? Call them formally colonized countries, and put the evil, and put the poverty, and put the confusion, put our colorism, put a whole bunch of the evils, put the curses of capitalism in the lap of where they belong. No third world. I want to
absolutely,
hear that again, because especially when I see my brown sisters and Latinx sisters and brothers, when I see y'all say it, it comes off as especially ignorant.
yeah,
Find out the truth, because this stuff, you can go to Google University, YouTube University, and none of what we're
yeah,
saying, although we are emotional, we are
yes,
passionate about what we believe
we're
in,
passionate.
none
I
of
mean,
what we are saying is based on a dream or a supposition. You can find the statistics, and you can follow the money, and you can
yeah,
follow the oil. Can you follow the gold? Can you
yes.
follow the cotton? Can you follow the sugar? Follow it
Follow
back
the
to the
sugar
source.
cane. Follow the sugar cane. I think, on a side note, when I got my house in Benin, my first home, it was so funny because there were banana. There was a couple of banana trees. There was a delicious mango tree, and then there was a patch of land that was growing sugar cane. And it was kind of like, I kind of felt like my ancestors were like playing kind of, I don't know, like they have a weird sense of humor. Because though many of you may or may not know, many Haitians come from a nation formerly known as Dahomey. And Dahomey is now today Benin. It is part of Nigeria. I think there's a part of maybe even Togo. Um, there are quite a few nations that Dahomey was a huge empire, right? It was one of the ancient empires. And so many enslaved Africans were taken from there, and Dahomey was heavily engaged in the slave trade, which is very unfortunate, and were brought to Ayiti. There's a film that is about to come out. I think Viola Davis is in it, and it has to do with the Benin warrior women, right? Some of those warrior women, some of those warrior people, right, were the ones in Haiti. So when I got my house and I was living there, seeing that my people were basically sold, my ancestors were sold from Dahomey, from that region of West Africa, and also the Congo, right? and they were sold mostly to harvest sugarcane. And one of the things that's really hard about, if you know anything about the slave conditions for Africans, was that to work in the sugarcane field, it was not sun up to sundown. It was much longer than that, and many did not survive 5 to 6 years in those conditions. And so basically, because people were so expendable, because their lives were not valued, that is how the slave trade grew. So people were being worked harder than animals. I mean, the current trend of everyone having, a dog or a cat, and, paying insurance, and animals getting Prozac. I mean, this wave of how people look at their animals, they would, and even when people say uh, Haitians or enslaved people were treated like animals, they're not treated like the animals here. No, I'm sorry. The way animals are treated here often are treated better than humans,
They were
right?
not
Many of us,
treated, they were not treated like antebellum animals, because let's be real. You got a
yeah,
pig, you got a sheep, you got a cow, you got to feed that thing and house that thing so you can get the milk. And if you don't fatten the hog, you're going to be eating bones. But they
right,
barely fed and clothed African people enough to stay alive. They didn't, the children were malnourished. So if you look at any person of color, African descent, anywhere today, and you realize that, unless we're on the continent, right, we're here, you realize that we came from the hardiest people. And despite what people say about us being ignorant, lazy, all the stereotypes, we wouldn't be here if it weren't for intelligence, if it weren't for strength, because our survival was not encouraged. We
right.
were, slaughtered spiritually, mentally, physically. So,
Physically.
and
And
getting back to sugar real quick, okay? It's like Regine says, sugar is, it is yet today still one of the hardest jobs in the world, like coal mining, those kind of things. It is
mhm,
dangerous. People lose limbs in a lot of these places in Florida and stuff. It's called the H2 worker program, right? Where they bring Caribbeans over to cut this cane. They still don't get adequate medical care. It is still like sharecropping. They are still brutalized today. And surprise, surprise, one of the largest lobbies in Congress is what? Big Sugar. Right there
yes,
with guns and tobacco.
yeah.
And again, follow that source back to the money, and you will find out why sometimes we battle for the rights of these people and people turn a blind eye.
There's a great podcast on sugar. If I can find it, I'll send it to you. But basically, when we think about when we there's so many things that are running through my mind, Marla. But I just wanted to check in and offer some, if there's a space for questions, if there's any questions that folks may have or that you may have, because I mean, if we start going into the conversation with sugar, that just takes us in a whole different direction. And really, when we think about the conditions in which people were living, and the fact that there still hasn't been compensation, there hasn't been adequate compensation or reparations to enslaved Africans here in the Americas, specifically the U.S. And in the Caribbean. When the British royalty came to Jamaica a few months ago, they did not get the welcome they were expecting, because many Jamaicans were calling for reparations, right? And that's the movement. The movement today is, if we have a greater awareness or consciousness, if we're in a space where we think we're quote unquote woke, what does that mean? Does that mean that we only are woke for ourselves, and that we're clear that equity has to deal with just these rights? Like, so are we for equity for just trans rights? Are we just equity for disability, equity for, but when it comes to issues of race, which are fundamental, like people still live within the privilege, the fact that Black and brown people are still harassed in this country, right? Based upon the color of their skin, not in the sense of if they have resources or don't, simply based upon that, then this is still the root work when we think about the shift that needs to happen around human rights and equity, is that we have to shift the way that we see each other. We have been conditioned and trained and socialized and educated to believe in this hierarchical belief of white misanthropy. And I prefer to say misanthropy rather than supremacy, because supremacy is a false idea. It's a false idea. So continuing to say it and perpetuate it doesn't work for me. but I see it as white misanthropy, this space in which everyone else has to serve the ideas of someone else, and that they don't have a right for their own ideas around their spirituality, their religion, their body, governing their body, right? Their politics, their history, right? So when we think about this, when we think about this shift and movement toward equity, there's a space in which each of us have to do the work. We actually have to go and read, go and meet and talk with people, step outside of what you thought. Unfortunately, Haiti suffers so much because it is maligned in so many ways, but it's also been a country that has had so many riches to this day. Iridium is still is one of the resources that's taken out of the country. So even though we think of Haiti as a poor country, it's actually has always been one of the richest countries, and it has been a country rich with a history and a people who understand what liberation actually is. And that is at the core that you can find. If you look up the Haitian Declaration of Independence, it is basically the motto of our independence is liberty or death.
Speaking of which, please tell us, I know you might be able to hold it up, a lovely picture of your coloring book, and talk about what it means and what it is so that we can see more. I think it's very interesting because when we talk about teaching tools and media, one of the most powerful things that you will see are images. And so let Regine, who is an ultimate, amazing media maker, teacher, educator, she and a family member put together this wonderful book, and it reinforces the beauty and the resilience of Haiti.
Absolutely. So the title of our gathering today is "Nous pas Bliye Ayiti." "Nous pas Bliye Ayiti." We will never forget Haiti. And that's Ayiti, spelled Ayiti. And that is one of the indigenous names of the land. When Jean-Jacques Dessalines and the governing body decided to name the nation, they honored the indigenous people with what it was called. So Ayiti, Quisqueya, Boyo was the name of the whole land that divides, that is now divided as Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So this book, Nous pas Bliye, it's a coloring book and a poetry, and it also has poetry in it. And it's basically images that I took of Haiti after the earthquake, images of beautiful people surviving a tragedy and pushing forward. And so this is an honoring of the resilience and the power of Haitian people. And so the historic images are transformed into a collection of illustrated images. And this work embraces the healing spiral of remembering and recovery. As a daughter of Ayiti, I'm accountable to those who came before, the living, and to those who follow, to keep empowering narratives of the African diaspora heard and seen. And so the illustrator is Tiffany Gomez, and she's an Afro-Latina artist in the DC area. So this book is available for purchase. It is a coloring book. There's a poem that has been translated into 6 languages, so you can learn it in Spanish, in Creole. You can learn it in Igbo. It is also in French and other languages. So I just thank you for putting that forward, Marla.
Absolutely no problem. Another question I have is, what can we learn from Africa and the Caribbean about independence, about freedom, about the fight, about fortitude? If you, I know, give me some bullet points, but if I'm just walking into this conversation or I'm like lost because this is a lot of information, what do I need to know to keep my head up?
Well, I think what's most important is to recognize that we don't really know the whole story. So one of the first things when we think about what does it mean to become free from a colonial power? What does it mean to become free from enslavement? Go and listen and read and check into the narratives and the writing of those speaking for themselves. The first thing that I would say is go and check out the Haitian Declaration of Independence. Read it. It's available in English. You can just look right online. You'll be able to find it. Fundamentally, the fight was for the ability to govern oneself. Very much like this new movement that is happening, that unfortunately many women and families have to deal with here. As our Supreme Court changes what we thought would never happen, or whatever our views are on it, recognizing that the fundamental rights that we feel that we have as American citizens and as women, and being able to make and to have choice, right? That's now being said, no, you don't have that. So imagine just a few hundred years ago, where this conversation was even further than that. It wasn't whether or not these people had the agency to say they had choice. They were being raped on a regular basis. Women were started, unfortunately, at the age of 13 or 14 into child labor, and were forced into having children. So by the time they were 20 or 21, they may have had 5 or 6 children, which they may have or not had a chance to raise or see. So when we think about liberation, when we think about freedom, we have to go further than the context of our current space that we're in. When we're thinking about, what does this mean? What's happening here in 2022? This was not the state of the world. This was not the state of the world in 1804, but it was the vision of a world. The reason why we now are able to say these are our rights and this is what we're fighting for is because of the visionaries of the Haitian Revolution, of independent movements throughout the African continent and throughout the Caribbean. Haiti is one nation, but there were many fights for liberation throughout. So one of the things I think is important to learn is to dig into the history of liberation movements. And a big part of that liberation movement came with an understanding of one's Africanness, one's identity. The big movement that we have in 22 around identity, what do I identify as, right? Or how I see myself. Imagine just saying that I identify as human and I identify as having the right to live freely.
I think I'm going to steal a quote off of one of my favorite Caribbean writers. He's Jamaican, Colin Channer. And many a moon ago, in a conversation, we talked about Afrocentrism, or how we identify in these things. And he said, the fundamental thing, and I want everyone to consider, is that if you are a person of African descent and you're thinking that your history started, as an enslaved person or an indentured person, or whatever you want to call yourself, coming to America, or the Americas, or even coming to the Caribbean, that's one thing. And that's a whole kind of identifier that it's not necessarily negative, but it's not necessarily an empowering narrative for yourself. But if we consider that year zero for our history started on the shores in Africa, somewhere in the forest in Africa, and that we had civilizations, we had legal, look, we in those regions and languages, and cultures, we have people who invented law, who invented commerce, who invented math, who had colleges and universities and institutions, and we educated ourselves and we traveled. And there is evidence that before we were enslaved, African people who come from amazing shipmen, right, and sailors, and built these technologies, we traveled to the Americas. We traveled that far, and there is what is it, archaeological evidence that we were here long before we get credit for being here, but we did not come with the colonial mindset.
Right, absolutely. A good book is They Came Before Columbus, Ivan Van Sertima. And he digs into the African presence that's throughout the Americas, that showed that Africans were coming back and forth way before Europe. Absolutely. Marla, if I could just insert here a quote from Dessalines. Dessalines, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Emperor Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Haiti's Ayiti's first leader. We have dared to be free. Let us dare to be so by ourselves and for ourselves, right? That's in essence, the freedom movements, liberation movements throughout the Caribbean and throughout Africa has been about people being able to decide for themselves. That's the key. That's key. And the other thing too, when we think about the role that Haiti has played, Haiti has also played a significant role in the independence movements in Colombia and Ecuador and Venezuela. These countries adopted the Haitian flag in honor of their help in gaining their independence. So if you look at the flag of Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela, it's very similar to the Haitian flag. And they've added their own emblems, but basically the bottom two colors are the colors of the Haitian flag, because freed Africans supported and helped Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela in their own liberation movements.
Regine, I think you've said a lot, but we're so proud and happy to host this conversation this afternoon. Is there anything else you want to leave us with?
I think there's so much that I think is important, but I think the most significant thing is to recognize the space in which we are ignorant. There is always a space in which we can learn more. There is always a space in which what we know or what we thought we knew when we were young, and then we got older and we realized, it's not quite like that. Kind of like parenting, like when you're a kid, you always think, hey, I could do it better. And then all of a sudden you become a parent and you realize, oh, that's why mom and dad did what they did, right? When it comes to understanding the histories of Black and brown people, go beyond what you think you know. Pick up a book authored by a Black or brown person. Pick up a book and read about the histories. Go deeper, go further, watch some films. Be open to conversations, ask questions. The hardest thing is to recognize that, it's uncomfortable not knowing. It's uncomfortable because then there's accountability. But that's the movement forward. The reality is that we have to get out of what we think we know and get into a space of a greater awareness and consciousness. And once we move into that space, then we are moving more as a collective, moving more within as a human experience, instead of a hierarchical space in which many are not being treated fairly. But because of my privilege or because of this, I don't really care. And ultimately, I think that when we think about liberation struggles, it allows us to begin to care and to empathize with others. Care and empathize with the conditions that they may have or their ancestors may have been, and then how did they make it to be where they are today? So that's my prayer, that I hope that we can grow and learn and read more and connect with each other. So Marla, that's what I'm putting forward, is that we have a space in which we're able to have caring conversations, like to care about someone, right? So that's the meditation that I'm putting forward.
Thank you so much for sharing, Regine. It has truly been a wonderful and empowering afternoon. And Regine basically spoke as the last words, to remember that despite our privilege, the way forward are to be allies. And that's what the Office of Human Rights and Equity strives to do. If you have ever experienced discrimination, or someone you know has experienced discrimination, if you would like to attend or schedule one of our many informative, engaging training experiences or programs, if you want to know more about us, visit our website at howardcounty.md.gov/OHRE. Thank you, everyone. Go forward in light and have a positive afternoon.